In the final collapsing days of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled around a burning Berlin, boys barely old enough to shave were handed rifles in the name of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. They were members of the Hitler Youth Teenagers, shaped by ideology, sent to defend a doomed regime. When the Red Army advanced westward, chaos swallowed the streets. Captured youths, some as young as 12 or 13, were often treated not as children, but as enemy combatants. Accounts speak of beatings, summary executions, forced marches, and brutal interrogations in the bitter aftermath of battle. In the fog of revenge and retribution, mercy was scarce. This is not a story of heroes, but of indoctrinated childhoods colliding with the vengeance of war. Tonight, we explore how propaganda turned boys into soldiers, and how, in the war's violent finale, they paid a devastating price. The winter of 1944 brought a sound that German civilians in the eastern provinces had dreaded for years. The distant rumble of Soviet artillery growing closer each day, a sound that residents of East Prussia described as resembling endless thunder rolling across the frozen landscape. From the frozen plains of Poland to the forests of East Prussia, the Red Army was advancing with a momentum that nothing could stop, carrying with it the accumulated fury of 4 years of unimaginable suffering. The soldiers who crossed into German territory were not merely an army seeking military victory, but witnesses to atrocities that demanded response. The survivors of a campaign of annihilation that had killed 27 million of their countrymen, a number so vast that it represented roughly 14% of the Soviet Union's pre-war population and exceeded the total military deaths of all other nations in the war combined. And waiting for them in hastily dug trenches and behind makeshift barricades were the final defenders of the Third Reich, among them thousands of boys in ill-fitting uniforms, children who had been promised glory and would instead discover the terrible price of the ideology they had absorbed since birth. The writer Vasily Grossman, who accompanied the Red Army as a correspondent, captured the strange nature of this confrontation. We are entering the lair of the fascist beast. The beast's children wait for us with guns, and we do not know whether to pity them or fear them. The collapse of Nazi Germany's eastern defenses began in earnest with Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive launched on June 22, 1944, deliberately timed to coincide with the third anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, in a symbolic gesture that Joseph Stalin personally approved. The operation, named after Prince Pyotr Bagration, the Georgian-Russian general who had died defending Moscow against Napoleon in 1812, dwarfed even the Normandy invasion in scale. Within weeks, the Red Army had destroyed Army Group Center, killing or capturing over 400,000 German soldiers in the greatest military disaster in German history, a catastrophe that exceeded even Stalingrad in its scope and permanently shattered the Wehrmacht's capacity for offensive operations. The offensive annihilated 28 German divisions entirely, erasing them from the order of battle as if they had never existed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of Soviet victories from Moscow to Stalingrad, who had risen from peasant origins to become the most decorated officer in Russian history, drove his forces westward with relentless determination that his soldiers both admired and feared. The road to Berlin, he wrote in his memoirs, published in 1969, was paved with German bones, as they had paved the road to Moscow with ours. By January of 1945, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River at points barely 50 miles from the German capital, close enough that reconnaissance pilots could see the spires of Berlin's churches on clear days. The Nazi leadership, which had promised victory until the very end and imprisoned or executed anyone who expressed doubt, now faced the impossible task of defending a collapsing empire with an army that existed increasingly on paper. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda who had built his career on lies, confided to his diary on January 27, 1945, "The situation in the East is catastrophic. I cannot understand how we allowed things to reach this point. The gap between propaganda and reality had become an abyss. and into that abyss fell the children of Germany. The deployment of Hitler Youth members in combat roles accelerated dramatically as the military situation deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, transforming what had been auxiliary service into frontline combat duty. The Volkssturm, created by Hitler's decree on September 25, 1944, represented the regime's final desperate gamble, a people's militia that would throw every available body against the advancing enemy in a last-ditch defense that military professionals recognized as futile. The decree establishing the Volkssturm invoked the spirit of the Prussian Landsturm of 1813, which had helped defeat Napoleon, but the historical parallel was grotesquely inappropriate. Napoleon's Grande Armée had been defeated by professional armies and Russian geography, not by elderly men and children with hunting rifles. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the crumbling Reich, oversaw the organization with characteristic brutality, threatening local officials who failed to meet recruitment quotas with accusations of defeatism that carried the death penalty. Boys as young as 14 and men as old as 60 were conscripted, given minimal training that sometimes lasted only a single afternoon, and issued whatever weapons could be found. In many units, the weapons were more dangerous to their users than to the enemy ancient rifles from the First World War, with worn barrels that could explode when fired, captured equipment with incompatible ammunition that jammed at critical moments, and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons that required the firer to expose himself completely to enemy fire while standing close enough to his target to be killed by the explosion if he succeeded. The Panzerfaust had an effective range of only 30 to 60 meters against moving targets, meaning that a successful shot often killed both the tank and the boy who fired it. Heinrich Böll, the future Nobel laureate who witnessed the Volkssturm mobilization in the Rhineland before his capture by American forces, later wrote in his autobiographical novel, The Silent Angel, "They gave children guns and called it patriotism. They sent grandfathers to dig trenches and called it duty. And when the children and grandfathers died, they called it heroism. And they printed their names in the newspaper as if dying for nothing were something to celebrate." The Hitler Youth formations in the East faced an enemy unlike any they had been prepared to encounter, despite years of anti-Bolshevik indoctrination that had painted the Soviet soldier as a primitive subhuman driven by Jewish masters. Soviet soldiers who crossed into Germany carried memories that no amount of military discipline could entirely suppress, wounds both physical and psychological that demanded acknowledgement. They had seen their villages burned, with inhabitants locked inside churches and barns, their families murdered in mass shootings that killed over 1 million Jews and countless other Soviet citizens, their comrades starved to death in German prisoner of war camps, where over 3 million Soviet soldiers perished from deliberate neglect, systematic starvation, and exposure to winter weather without shelter. The treatment of Soviet prisoners represented one of the war's most horrific crimes. German camps like Stalag 3B at Fürstenberg held over 50,000 Soviet prisoners in conditions designed to kill them, with mortality rates exceeding 60% in the first winter of the war. The German High Command had explicitly ordered that Soviet prisoners were not to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, which the Soviet Union had not signed, creating a legal pretext for mass murder. The soldiers advancing into Germany had walked through the ruins of cities like Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army had fought for every building, while the civilian population starved around them, reduced to eating rats, leather belts, and finally each other. Many Red Army soldiers had received letters from home describing atrocities committed by German occupation forces, the Einsatzgruppen death squads that had murdered over 1 million Jews in the occupied Soviet Union. The systematic execution of suspected partisans that had depopulated entire regions of Belarus, the deportation of millions of Soviet citizens for forced labor in Germany, where they were worked to death in factories and mines. Ilya Ehrenberg, the Soviet journalist whose wartime writings had enormous influence on Red Army morale and who had lost family members to the Nazi genocide, captured this accumulated fury in prose that still disturbs readers decades later. We shall not speak any more. We shall not get excited. We shall kill. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day. If you think that your neighbor will kill a German for you, you have not understood the threat. If you do not kill the German will kill you. Such exhortations, while officially disavowed by Soviet leadership after the war, when Stalin ordered Ehrenberg to moderate his tone in April 1945, reflected genuine sentiments that years of suffering had produced and that no order could simply erase. The Battle of Berlin, which began on April 16, 1945, with an artillery barrage involving over 40,000 guns that could be heard 100 kilometers away, brought these colliding forces together in a cataclysm that would claim over 300,000 lives in less than 3 weeks, more than the entire American death toll in the European theater. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced on the capital with over 2.5 million soldiers, supported by more than 6,000 tanks, facing German defenses that included substantial numbers of Hitler Youth combatants mixed with remnants of regular Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units. The Soviet offensive opened with a spectacular failure when Zhukov ordered 143 searchlights turned on to blind the German defenders at the Silo Heights. But the lights merely illuminated Soviet troops, advancing through morning mist and dust, turning them into perfect targets. The fighting at the Silo Heights cost Zhukov over 30,000 casualties in 3 days and earned him a furious rebuke from Stalin, who threatened to give Konev the honor of capturing Berlin if Zhukov could not move faster. The boys defending the heights had been positioned throughout the defensive perimeter, assigned to anti-tank teams and infantry units defending the approaches to the government district. General Helmuth Weidling, the last commandant of Berlin's defenses, who had initially been summoned to the Führer bunker, expecting to be executed for unauthorized retreat before Hitler instead appointed him to command the city's defense, later estimated that Hitler Youth members constituted roughly 10% of the forces under his command, perhaps 45,000 boys, in a garrison of approximately 4,500 soldiers and militia. Some units consisted almost entirely of teenagers, commanded by wounded veterans or elderly reservists, recalled to duty after years of civilian life. The Müncheberg Panzer Division, defending Thech's eastern approaches to Berlin in the suburb of that name, reported that its infantry replacements in the final weeks included boys who had received only 3 days of weapons training and had never fired a shot in combat before being ordered to hold positions against veteran Soviet tank crews. The division's war diary, recovered after the war, contains the laconic entry for April 21st. Replacements arrived. Average age 16 years. Equipment inadequate. Morale excellent. Life expectancy minimal. The fighting for Berlin combined the worst elements of urban warfare with the particular horrors of ideological conflict between enemies who had been taught to view each other as something less than human. Soviet forces advanced block by block through a city already devastated by years of Allied bombing that had killed over 50,000 civilians and left a third of the housing stock destroyed or damaged beyond habitation. The ruins provided perfect defensive positions but also perfect death traps. Cellars collapsed under artillery fire, burying defenders alive, while Soviet troops developed tactics for clearing buildings that involved pumping gasoline into basements and igniting it. The teenage defenders, many of them experiencing combat for the first time after years of training that had never included the reality of watching friends die beside them, fought with the desperation of those who had been taught that surrender meant death or worse. Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with lurid descriptions of Soviet barbarism, accounts of mass killings and widespread violence that, while containing elements of truth that would be documented after the war, had been exaggerated to grotesque proportions to ensure resistance to the last. Goebbels's propaganda ministry had produced pamphlets describing in graphic detail what Soviet soldiers would allegedly do to German women and children, ensuring that many civilians would choose to take their own lives rather than surrender. This propaganda created a self-fulfilling prophecy. In many cases, boys who refused to surrender and fought until killed or wounded provoked responses from Soviet soldiers whose patience had been exhausted by years of war and whose comrades were dying to the last bullet fired by children they might otherwise have spared. Vasily Grossman, the Soviet writer who accompanied the Red Army into Berlin as a war correspondent, and whose novel Life and Fate would later be suppressed by the Soviet government for its unflinching honesty, documented scenes that defied easy moral categorization. I saw a German boy, perhaps 15 years old, manning a machine gun in the window of a ruined apartment building until a shell silenced it. Then I saw what remained of him, scattered across the rubble like broken furniture, and I thought of my own daughter who had been killed by the Nazis in Berdichev, and I did not know what to feel. Rage that he had fought us, pity that he had died so young, both feelings were true, and they tore at each other inside me. The treatment of captured Hitler Youth members varied enormously depending on circumstances that could change from one street to the next, from one Soviet unit to another, and from 1 hour to the next as the chaos of battle ebbed and flowed. Some surrendering boys were processed correctly as prisoners of war according to established procedures, disarmed, searched for weapons and documents, and sent to collection points for eventual transport to the rear, where they would join the hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners in Soviet hands. Officers who maintained discipline over their units, particularly those with political commissars who emphasized the importance of taking prisoners for intelligence purposes, generally ensured that surrenders were accepted. Others were not so fortunate, encountering Soviet soldiers in moments of rage or grief that overrode military discipline and basic humanity. Documented cases from the battle include summary executions of boys who surrendered after inflicting casualties on Soviet units. One account from the fighting around Tempelhof Airport describes a group of 6 Hitler Youth members being shot after surrendering because they had just killed 3 Soviet soldiers with a Panzerfaust that destroyed a T-34 tank. Beatings of captured teenagers by soldiers whose comrades had just been killed were common enough that some Soviet commanders issued specific orders prohibiting striking prisoners, orders that were frequently ignored in the heat of battle. Reprisal killings in areas where German resistance had been particularly fierce served as warnings to other defenders in several documented instances. Captured German soldiers and Hitler Youth members were shot in view of positions still held by their comrades, their bodies left displayed as inducements to surrender. The chaos of urban combat, where command structures broke down and individual soldiers made life and death decisions without supervision, made any consistent policy impossible to enforce across an operation involving millions of combatants. Soviet commanders from Zhukov down to battalion level issued orders prohibiting mistreatment of prisoners who surrendered peacefully, but these orders frequently went unheeded in the heat of battle by soldiers who had lost friends minutes or hours earlier. Marshal Zhukov himself addressed the issue in his post-battle reports submitted to Stalin, acknowledging excesses while attributing them to the understandable fury of soldiers who had lost friends and family to German aggression and who could not be expected to maintain perfect discipline after years of brutal warfare. The historical record requires careful navigation between documented events and later propaganda embellishments that served Cold War purposes on both sides, a challenge that historians continue to grapple with decades after the events occurred. Western accounts from the immediate post-war period, often based on German survivor testimonies collected by American and British occupation authorities eager to document Soviet misconduct, tended to emphasize Soviet brutality while minimizing or ignoring the context of German atrocities that had provoked such responses. These accounts served obvious political purposes as the wartime alliance gave way to Cold War confrontation, and their reliability varies enormously depending on how and by whom they were collected. The German historian Heinz Nauratil, whose 1986 book, Black Book of Communism, compiled German civilian casualty claims, has been criticized by other scholars for accepting uncorroborated testimonies and inflated figures that served West German political agendas. Soviet accounts took the opposite approach, denying or minimizing misconduct while emphasizing the heroism of the Red Army and the legitimate grievances that motivated its soldiers, presenting a sanitized version of events that survivors knew to be false. The official Soviet history of the war, published in multiple volumes during the Brezhnev era, contains almost no acknowledgement of crimes committed by Soviet forces in Germany, treating the conquest as a purely military operation conducted with exemplary discipline. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between these politically motivated extremes. Serious historical scholarship, drawing on archives, opened after the Soviet collapse in 1991, and the subsequent declassification of millions of documents previously inaccessible to Western researchers, confirms that both widespread mistreatment and individual acts of mercy occurred during the conquest of Germany. Stefan Kahner, of the University of Graz, whose research on German prisoners in Soviet captivity drew on archives in Moscow, Vienna, and the former Soviet republics, documented numerous cases of Hitler Youth prisoners being executed after surrender, particularly in the immediate aftermath of combat. At the same time, other researchers, including Catherine Meridale, whose book Ivan's War reconstructed the experiences of ordinary Soviet soldiers through interviews and archival research, have found evidence of Soviet soldiers sharing rations with captured boys, providing medical treatment to wounded teenage prisoners, and intervening to prevent mistreatment by their comrades who had lost control in the chaos of battle. The executions that did occur followed patterns that historians have identified across the Eastern Front's final phase, patterns shaped by the specific circumstances of combat and the accumulated grievances of soldiers who had been fighting for nearly 4 years. Boys captured immediately after combat, especially those who had inflicted casualties on the units capturing them, faced the greatest risk of summary execution rather than imprisonment. The psychology was brutally simple. A Soviet soldier who had just watched his friend die to a Panzerfaust fired by a teenager in Hitler Youth uniform had little inclination toward mercy when he encountered another teenager in a similar uniform moments later. The desire for revenge in such moments was overwhelming, and the presence of officers who might enforce discipline was often absent in the confusion of urban combat. The anonymity of urban warfare compounded the problem in the chaos of street fighting. Individual soldiers made decisions without supervision, and those decisions were often shaped by grief and rage rather than military protocol. SS insignia, worn by members of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and other Waffen-SS units that had committed documented atrocities throughout the war, acted as virtual death warrants in many cases. Soviet soldiers had learned through bitter experience that SS troops rarely surrendered and frequently committed atrocities when they had the opportunity. The Malmedy massacre of American prisoners in December 1944 was only the most famous example of SS conduct toward captured enemies. The assumption that any SS member was guilty until proven innocent, an assumption that extended to teenage conscripts who had been assigned to SS units without choice, led to executions that claimed unknown numbers of lives. At the town of Demmin, in Mecklenburg, approximately 200 kilometers north of Berlin, the arrival of Soviet forces in late April triggered a mass tragedy, in which many German civilians took their own lives that remains one of the most disturbing episodes of the war's final days. Hundreds of residents, including entire families with children who had been convinced by Nazi propaganda that death was preferable to Soviet occupation, drowned themselves in the rivers Peene and Tollens, or hanged themselves in their homes. Estimates of the dead range from 900 to over 1,000 in a town of approximately 15,000 inhabitants. These tragic deaths were followed by violent reprisals by Soviet forces through the town that killed additional civilians and prisoners in circumstances that remain disputed, with German sources describing indiscriminate murder and Soviet sources claiming legitimate military operations against continued resistance from bypassed German units. The town of Treuenbrietzen, located approximately 50 kilometers south of Berlin in Brandenburg, witnessed events that illustrate the volatile mixture of revenge, fear, and military necessity that characterized the final weeks of the war in the East. Soviet forces captured the town on April 21, 1945, after heavy fighting that had cost casualties on both sides, taking numerous prisoners, including Hitler Youth members who had participated in the defense, alongside older Volkssturm militia and remnants of regular Wehrmacht units. The town's strategic importance lay in its position along routes leading to the capital, making its capture essential to the Soviet advance. Over the following days, in circumstances that remain partially obscure due to the destruction of records and the death of witnesses, over 1,000 German civilians and prisoners were killed in what German sources describe as a massacre, and Soviet sources characterized as legitimate military operations against continued resistance from German soldiers who had hidden among the civilian population. The presence of Hitler Youth fighters among the defenders complicated any simple narrative of innocent victims and guilty perpetrators. These were simultaneously children deserving protection under any reasonable moral standard and combatants who had killed Soviet soldiers and might kill more if released. When Red Army troops discovered the bodies of Soviet prisoners who had been executed by SS units in the Trojan-Brietzen area during the town's defense, including prisoners who had been shot while attempting to surrender, reprisals followed that did not discriminate by age or combatant status. The bodies of executed Soviet prisoners were displayed to Red Army soldiers as evidence of German treachery, inflaming passions that commanders could not control. Kurt Diekert, a German officer who passed through the area after its capture, while attempting to reach American lines to surrender, described finding bodies of boys in the streets, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes they had apparently changed into hoping to escape detection, shot or beaten to death, in positions that suggested they had been trying to flee or hide. Whether these were combatants caught attempting to escape, suspected combatants identified by informers, or simply victims of undirected violence, remains impossible to determine with certainty decades later, given the destruction of relevant records and the death of most witnesses. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police organization that accompanied the Red Army's advance and operated with authority independent of military commanders, added another dimension to the chaos facing young German prisoners. NKVD units were responsible for screening captured Germans to identify war criminals who could be tried for specific offenses, intelligence targets who possessed valuable information about German military and political matters, and individuals who might be useful to the Soviet occupation as collaborators or administrators. This screening process, conducted under conditions of extreme pressure with few trained personnel and limited time as the front moved forward, inevitably produced errors that could prove fatal. Boys who had held minor leadership positions in the Hitler Youth troop leaders, who had supervised groups of younger boys, found themselves classified alongside SS officers and concentration camp guards as active fascists, requiring special handling. The NKVD operated according to categories that made little allowance for the nuances of individual cases. Hitler Youth membership was evidence of fascist indoctrination. Leadership positions within the Hitler Youth were evidence of active participation in the fascist system, and active participation merited punishment regardless of the age at which it had occurred. The NKVD's mandate to identify fascist elements for special treatment created a category elastic enough to encompass almost anyone who had participated in Nazi organizations which, given the mandatory nature of Hitler Youth membership after 1936, included virtually every German male under the age of 25. Ivan Serov, the NKVD general who oversaw security operations in Germany and who would later become the first chairman of the KGB, issued directives calling for the identification and detention of all active fascists, a category that his subordinates in the field interpreted broadly when faced with the practical challenges of processing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Serov, a ruthless operator who had overseen the deportation of ethnic minorities within the Soviet Union during the war, brought the same systematic brutality to his German operations. His reports to Moscow documented the arrest of tens of thousands of Germans in the occupation zone's first months, many of them teenage former Hitler Youth members whose primary crime was having been born at the wrong time, in the wrong country. The circumstances of surrender varied dramatically and often determined whether a young prisoner lived or died in ways that seemed almost random to those who survived to tell their stories. Organized surrenders conducted through military channels, with officers present to negotiate terms and maintain discipline on both sides, offered the best chance of survival for Hitler Youth prisoners. When German officers arranged formal capitulations with their Soviet counterparts, the presence of authority figures on both sides created conditions in which proper treatment of prisoners was more likely to be observed. Individual surrenders, or the capture of small groups in the chaos of combat, presented far greater dangers, as prisoners encountered Soviet soldiers without the moderating influence of officers concerned about maintaining discipline. A boy who threw down his weapon and raised his hands might be accepted as a prisoner by one Soviet soldier and shot by another standing 10 feet away whose brother had been killed by Germans 3 years earlier in Ukraine. The language barrier compounded the problem. Few German teenagers spoke Russian and few Soviet soldiers spoke German, making communication nearly impossible in moments when misunderstanding could prove fatal. Hand signals that a German understood as surrender might be interpreted differently by a Soviet soldier whose previous experience of German troops had taught him to expect treachery and hidden weapons. German soldiers had been known to feign surrender before attacking Soviet troops who approached to accept their capitulation, creating suspicion that endangered genuine attempts to give up. The memoir literature from both sides contains numerous accounts of near executions, prevented only by the intervention of an officer or a cooler-headed comrade who recognized that the trembling boy in the oversized uniform posed no threat, as well as executions that proceeded despite attempts at intervention by soldiers who retained enough humanity to see children rather than enemies. Nikolai Inozemtsev, a Soviet soldier who later became a prominent economist in the post-Stalin era, wrote in his diary on April 25, 1945, "Today, I stopped Petrov from shooting a German boy who could not have been more than 15. Petrov's wife and daughter were killed in Minsk. I understood his rage, but I could not let him do it. The boy reminded me of my nephew." The rage that Soviet soldiers carried into Germany had been building for nearly 4 years, accumulating with each village burned, each family member killed, each letter from home bearing news of another atrocity committed by German occupation forces. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, had been conceived by Hitler as a war of annihilation rather than a conventional military campaign, a conflict whose purpose was not merely to defeat an enemy, but to destroy entire peoples and create living space for German colonization of the East. The war directives issued before the invasion made this intention explicit in language that would later serve as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The Commissar Order, signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on June 6, 1941, directed German troops to execute captured Soviet political officers without trial, a clear violation of the laws of war that made every German soldier who obeyed it a war criminal. The Hunger Plan, developed by Reich Minister Herbert Backe and approved by Hermann Göring, aimed to starve 30 million Soviet civilians to death in order to feed the German army and population from captured Soviet agricultural production. This was not hyperbole or wartime propaganda, but documented policy preserved in German archives. Backe explicitly calculated the number of deaths that would result from his plan and accepted them as necessary. The Einsatzgruppen death squads had followed the Wehrmacht's advance across the Soviet Union, systematically murdering Jews, Roma, Communist Party members, and anyone else deemed racially or politically undesirable, killing over 1 million people in mass shootings that represented the first phase of the Holocaust. The massacre at Babi Yar, outside Kiev in September 1941, killed over 33,000 Jews in 2 days, their bodies dumped into a ravine that became one of the war's most notorious killing sites. By the war's end, the German occupation of Soviet territory had killed an estimated 17 million Soviet civilians, in addition to the millions of military casualties, a toll that represented not collateral damage from military operations, but deliberate genocide. These numbers were not abstractions to the soldiers who entered Germany in 1945. They represented mothers, fathers, siblings, children, friends whose deaths demanded response, whose memory accompanied every soldier who crossed the border into the Reich. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who served as an artillery captain in the Red Army and would later become the Soviet Union's most famous dissident after his novels exposed the Gulag system, witnessed and participated in events that haunted him for the rest of his life and that he processed through his writing for decades afterward. His poem, Prussian Nights, written secretly during his imprisonment in the Gulag for criticizing Stalin in a private letter and smuggled out of the camps in his memory, described scenes he had observed during the conquest of East Prussia in January and February 1945, soldiers raping German women while their officers looked away or participated, shooting civilians who resisted or simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment, looting homes and burning what they could not carry while their commanders focused on military objectives. The poem's most disturbing passage describes a mother and daughter killed after being assaulted, their bodies left in a burning house, imagery that Solzhenitsyn presented not with satisfaction but with horror at what he and his comrades had become. Solzhenitsyn did not excuse what he had seen but sought to understand it in the context of what had been done to his own people, recognizing that the perpetrators of these crimes in Germany had themselves been victims of crimes committed against them in the Soviet Union. "We had been transformed by 4 years of war," he wrote decades later in the memoirs published after his exile from the Soviet Union. "We had seen things that no human being should see, and we had become capable of things that no human being should do. The Germans had taught us to hate, and we had learned the lesson well, perhaps too well." His testimony, along with that of other Soviet veterans who broke their silence in the decades following Stalin's death, when the cult of the Great Patriotic War began to allow for more nuanced accounts, provides crucial evidence of events that official Soviet historiography long denied had ever occurred. The Soviet government suppressed Prussian Nights and Solzhenitsyn's other works that challenged the heroic narrative, recognizing that honest accounts of Soviet conduct in Germany would undermine the moral legitimacy the regime claimed from its victory over fascism. The fate of Hitler Youth prisoners in the immediate aftermath of combat depended heavily on factors beyond anyone's control, creating a randomness that survivors struggled to comprehend or explain in later years. A unit's recent casualties determined the mood of the soldiers who accepted surrenders. The troops who had just lost comrades were far more likely to take revenge on prisoners than those who had advanced without losses. Individual commanders' temperament varied enormously, from officers who strictly enforced discipline to those who tacitly encouraged their men to take revenge. The specific circumstances of the engagement mattered as well. Boys captured after brief firefights faced different treatment than those captured after prolonged battles that had cost heavy casualties on both sides. And pure chance played perhaps the largest role of all, whether the soldier who first encountered a surrendering boy had lost family members to German atrocities, whether an officer arrived in time to intervene, whether the prisoner reminded his captor of a son or nephew, or simply looked frightened enough to inspire pity rather than rage. Heinrich Severloh, a German machine gunner who had killed perhaps hundreds of American soldiers at Omaha Beach on D-Day, when his position at Widerstandsnest 62 overlooked the landing beaches, and who later served on the Eastern Front until Germany's collapse, surrendered to Soviet forces in May 1945 near the town of Halbe, where tens of thousands of German soldiers attempting to escape westward were encircled and destroyed. He survived imprisonment and later reflected on the arbitrary nature of his survival in interviews given decades later. "There were moments when I should have been shot, when any reasonable soldier would have shot me after what I had done. I had killed hundreds of men, perhaps thousands. Why I lived when others died, I cannot explain. Perhaps the soldier who took my surrender was tired. Perhaps he had not lost anyone that day. Perhaps God decided I should live to remember what I had done." For the teenage prisoners who shared his captivity, the same randomness applied with equal force. Some were treated with surprising gentleness by Soviet soldiers, who saw them as children victimized by the Nazi regime rather than as enemies deserving punishment. Others were beaten, executed, or simply disappeared into the chaos of the war's final days, their fates unknown to families who would spend decades searching for information that would never come. The historian Norman Naimark, whose scholarship on the Soviet occupation of Germany, published in his 1995 book, The Russians in Germany, remains definitive and has shaped all subsequent research on the topic, has documented the complexity of Soviet behavior toward young prisoners, with evidence drawn from both German and Russian archives that became available after the Cold War ended. His research confirms that mistreatment was widespread but not universal, that executions occurred but were not official policy sanctioned by Soviet leadership, and that individual Soviet soldiers and units behaved very differently depending on circumstances, leadership, and the particular histories they carried with them into Germany. The Red Army was not a monolithic force but an organization containing millions of individuals with varying motivations, moral capacities, and personal experiences that shaped their behavior in ways no order could entirely control. Some soldiers had been brutalized by war to the point of savagery, having witnessed atrocities that destroyed their capacity for mercy. Others retained their humanity despite everything they had experienced, recognizing in frightened German teenagers the same vulnerability they had seen in their own children, siblings, or nephews. The Hitler Youth prisoners they encountered benefited or suffered from this variation, depending on factors entirely beyond their control: which unit captured them, which soldiers processed them, which officers supervised their transport to the rear. Naimark concludes that the Soviet occupation of Germany represented a period of profound moral ambiguity in which extraordinary cruelty and unexpected kindness existed side by side, often in the same unit, sometimes in the same individual. The end of combat operations, on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, celebrated with jubilation in Moscow, London, and Washington, did not end the violence, but merely transformed its character from military conflict to occupation. The boys who survived the immediate aftermath of surrender now faced a different set of dangers that would determine whether they lived to see adulthood or died far from home in the vastness of the Soviet Union. The NKVD screening process separated prisoners into categories that would determine their fates, some marked for quick release, others for labor camps, still others for special interrogation from which many would not return. Transportation to collection camps under conditions that killed thousands awaited those processed for transfer to the Soviet Union. And the long uncertainty of Soviet captivity, stretching for some prisoners over a decade before repatriation, would test survival skills that no Hitler Youth training had ever anticipated. They had been taught to view the Soviets as subhuman monsters incapable of civilization, and many of them encountered treatment that seemed to confirm this characterization in ways that reinforced rather than challenged their indoctrination. But they had also been taught to view themselves as heroes defending Western civilization against barbarism, never acknowledging that their nation had committed barbarities far worse than anything they would experience as prisoners. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the deliberate starvation of millions of Soviet civilians, the destruction of entire cities and peoples in pursuit of racial ideology. This moral blindness, cultivated through years of indoctrination that began before they could form independent judgments, would take decades to erode and in some cases never faded at all, leaving elderly men still convinced that they had been victims rather than instruments of the greatest crime in human history. In the ashes of 1945, as Berlin fell and the Hitler Youth dissolved into the rubble of a shattered Reich, the war did not end gently for everyone. For many captured by the advancing Red Army, childhood vanished in prison camps, interrogations, and forced marches eastward. They had been molded by the regime of Adolf Hitler, but when the reckoning came, they faced it as boys in a man's war. History leaves us with uncomfortable truths. Indoctrination steals innocence, and vengeance rarely restores it. As philosopher George Santayana warned, Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So we remember not to inflame, not to excuse, but to understand. Thank you for watching. Until next time, may we study history with open eyes and guarded hearts.